At 6:40 p.m., Flight 227 to Osaka was supposed to be boarding. Instead, a storm system nobody had forecasted 12 hours earlier was quietly rewriting everyone's evening. The gate agent's voice crackled over the intercom, apologizing for a delay that would eventually stretch to 6 full hours, though nobody in the gate area knew that yet. Hannah had already resigned herself to a long wait, claiming a seat near the window, pulling out a book she had no real intention of finishing. Across the gate area, Sora scanned the increasingly crowded rows of seats for anywhere to sit, his flight bag heavy on his shoulder, mildly irritated at the delay eating into his evening plans. Then his eyes landed on a profile he would have recognized anywhere, in any lighting after any number of years. Hannah looked up from her book at the exact same instant, as though some old, unexplainable instinct had told her to. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The noise of the terminal, announcements, rolling suitcases, a crying toddler somewhere nearby, simply faded into background static. 6 years of silence sat between them, and neither of them had the faintest idea how to close that kind of distance in a crowded airport gate. And somewhere behind them, the departure board flickered once more, quietly confirming that neither of them was going anywhere for a very long time. This is the story of the 6 hours that undid 6 years. 6 years earlier, Hannah and Sora had been assigned adjacent seats in a mandatory economics lecture neither of them particularly wanted to take, a small administrative accident that neither of them would later be able to imagine their lives without. What started as occasionally comparing lecture notes turned, within a month, into something considerably warmer. Sora found himself looking forward to that economics class more than any subject actually justified, and Hannah began arriving early just to save him a seat, a small habit neither of them commented on until it had already become an unspoken routine. They spent the next 3 years thoroughly, unguardedly in love, the way only people who haven't yet had their hearts seriously tested can be. Sora was steady and patient, the kind of person who made big decisions feel smaller and more manageable simply by being present for them. Hannah was sharp and ambitious, pulling him gently out of his comfort zone in ways he came to genuinely appreciate. They talked often about the future, an apartment together after graduation, careers they'd build side by side, a life that felt, at 21, entirely within reach if they simply wanted it enough. There was a particular storm during their second year together that had knocked out power across half the campus, and instead of taking shelter like everyone else, they'd climbed to the roof of Hannah's dormitory to watch the lightning together, soaked and laughing, entirely unafraid of anything the weather could throw at them. Sora would think of that night, years later, sitting in a delayed airport gate during an entirely different storm, and wonder if some part of him had been quietly waiting for weather to bring them back together again. What Sora didn't fully understand at the time, though he sensed it occasionally in small, unexplained tensions, was that Hannah carried a quiet fear she rarely spoke about directly. Watching her own parents' marriage slowly hollow out over the years into arrangement of polite obligation rather than genuine partnership, both of them having sacrificed so much of themselves for the relationship that very little of who they'd once been remained. There had been a moment, nearly a year before the breakup, at a mutual friend's wedding, when the officiant spoke about two people becoming one, and Hannah had felt an inexplicable, immediate urge to leave the room. She'd excused herself to the restroom, splashing cold water on her face, unable to explain even to herself why a phrase meant to sound romantic had landed instead like a quiet threat. Sora had found her afterward, gently asking if she was all right, and Hannah had smiled and blamed the champagne, filing the moment away as an oddity rather than the warning sign it actually was. The first small crack in a fear that would eventually widen into the decision that ended everything between them. In their final semester, Sora brought up moving in together seriously for the first time, showing her a modest apartment listing he'd already looked into, genuinely excited about the next deliberate step in a relationship that had, until then, unfolded almost entirely without difficult conversations. Hannah smiled and said all the right things in the moment, but something cold and immediate had gripped her chest the instant she saw the listing. A sudden, overwhelming vision of her own mother, 20 years earlier, saying yes to an identical kind of commitment with the exact same hopeful excitement, only to slowly disappear into it over the following 2 decades. She lay awake long after Sora had fallen asleep that night, replaying the conversation with a mounting, irrational terror that had nothing to do with him specifically and everything to do with a fear she had never once said out loud to anyone. That loving someone this completely, this early, might cost her the same thing it had quietly cost her mother. Within 2 weeks, without discussing it with Sora first, Hannah had applied for and been accepted into an accelerated exchange program abroad, an opportunity she'd previously dismissed as impractical, suddenly transformed into an urgent, necessary escape route from a future that had started to feel less like a dream and more like a slow, well-intentioned trap. When she told him, framing it entirely as an unmissable academic opportunity, Sora didn't fully believe the explanation, though he had no evidence to argue against it. "Is this about the apartment?" he'd asked quietly. "No," Hannah had said, too quickly, too firmly, closing a door on the actual conversation before it had properly opened. They broke up 2 weeks before her departure, both agreeing, out loud, that long distance across an ocean simply wasn't realistic for 2 21-year-olds still figuring out their own lives. It was technically a true statement. It just wasn't the actual reason, and Hannah had let that smaller, easier truth stand in for the larger, more frightening one for 6 entire years since. The 2 weeks between the breakup and her departure were among the strangest of both their lives. Still technically together in every practical sense, still sharing meals and study sessions, but carefully, deliberately avoiding any conversation that might reopen the door either of them had just closed. Hannah spent those 2 weeks torn between relief at having created distance from a fear she couldn't articulate, and a grief so heavy some nights she nearly called the whole plan off. The night before her flight, they sat together on the same rooftop where they'd once watched that storm, neither of them saying much of anything, both silently aware that something significant was ending without either of them having the language yet to name what it actually was. Sora spent the years since building a solid, dependable career, the same steady patience that had once made him such an easy person to love now quietly channeled into work that rewarded exactly that quality. He dated occasionally, carefully, never quite reaching the specific intensity he remembered from those 3 university years, though he told himself that was simply what growing up looked like. Hannah thrived professionally during her years abroad, and after, building exactly the kind of independent, accomplished life she'd once feared losing entirely to a relationship. But every romantic connection that began to feel even slightly serious triggered the same old panic, the same quiet, urgent need to create distance before anyone got close enough to require the kind of sacrifice she'd watched her mother make. Her mother asked, gently but persistently, during nearly every phone call, whether there was anyone special in her life. Hannah always deflected with career updates, never quite able to explain that the specific example her mother had unknowingly provided was the exact reason she kept sabotaging every chance at exactly what her mother was hoping for her. Sora, for his part, had grown quietly tired of friends and family gently asking why someone as steady and reliable as him hadn't settled down yet, an explanation he'd never fully worked out himself beyond a vague sense that nothing since university had ever quite measured up to a standard he rarely let himself examine too closely. He had come close once, about 2 years after Hannah left, to something genuinely serious with a colleague named Yuki. Kind, patient, entirely deserving of more than Sora ultimately gave her. The relationship ended gently, mutually, with Yuki telling him, not unkindly, that some part of him always seemed to be waiting for a phone call that never came. Sora hadn't fully understood what she meant at the time. Sitting in the delayed gate now, watching Hannah across the crowded terminal, the observation landed with considerably more weight than it had 2 years earlier. Hannah had her own version of Yuki, a thoughtful architect she'd dated for nearly a year abroad, who had eventually, gently, told her that loving her sometimes felt like loving someone standing permanently near an exit, ready to leave the moment the room felt too warm. She had denied it at the time. Some quiet, honest part of her had known, even then, that he wasn't wrong. After what felt like several full minutes of neither of them moving, Sora finally crossed the gate area, settling into a seat 2 spaces away from her rather than directly beside her. An old instinct for careful distance neither of them had fully unlearned. Sora, she finally said, closing the book she hadn't actually been reading. It's been a while. 6 years, he said, the number arriving faster than he meant it to, revealing more than he'd intended about exactly how closely he'd been counting. The gate agent's voice crackled overhead again, extending the delay by another 2 hours, the storm apparently showing no signs of clearing. Neither of them said anything about the extended timeline, though both privately registered exactly how many additional hours they were now committed to sharing the same crowded gate area. For the first hour, they kept the conversation carefully surface level: careers, mutual friends, the specific absurdity of the weather delay itself. Hannah learned Sora had stayed in the same city, built the steady career she'd always predicted he would. Sora learned Hannah had built an impressive career abroad before returning home just 8 months ago, a detail that landed with more weight than either of them acknowledged out loud. There were several pauses in that first hour where the conversation threatened to drift somewhere more honest, and each time, one of them reached for their phone or commented on the weather, an unspoken mutual agreement to keep circling the surface a little longer before either of them was ready to dive underneath it. As the gate area grew increasingly crowded with other delayed passengers, Hannah and Sora migrated, almost without discussing it, to a quieter corner near a darkened, closed gate, putting some welcome distance between themselves and the mounting chaos of the main waiting area. "Can I ask you something?" Sora said, once they'd settled into the relative quiet. "The exchange program. Was that actually about the opportunity, or was I right that it was about something else?" Hannah felt her chest tighten with a specific, familiar dread of a question she'd successfully avoided for 6 years, finally catching up with her in an airport gate she couldn't simply walk away from. She could have deflected again, the way she'd deflected every version of this question from friends and family for 6 years. But something about the strange, suspended nature of the evening, stranded together by weather neither of them controlled, with nowhere convenient to escape to, made the old deflection feel exhausting rather than protective. "It wasn't really about the opportunity," she admitted quietly. "I panicked when you showed me that apartment listing. Not because of you, because of what I was scared it would eventually turn me into." Sora sat with the admission for a long moment, resisting the urge to immediately ask the dozen follow-up questions crowding his mind at once. He'd learned, somewhere over 6 years of quiet, unresolved grief, that rushing someone through a difficult truth rarely got you the whole of it. So he simply waited, giving her the space to continue at her own pace, the way he might have, If he'd only known 6 years earlier that this particular patience was exactly what she'd needed from him. Sora sat with that for a moment, genuinely confused. What do you mean, turn you into? Hannah took a breath. 6 years of an unspoken explanation finally finding its way toward the surface. My parents, she said. They were exactly like us once. Genuinely happy, genuinely in love, in their 20s, making exactly the kind of plans we were making. And I watched my entire childhood as they slowly disappeared into each other's obligations until neither of them seemed to have anything left that was actually theirs. My mother gave up a career she loved. My father stopped seeing his own friends. By the time I was in high school, they weren't unhappy exactly. They were just gone. Both of them, quietly erased by a marriage that started exactly the way ours was starting. She remembered specifically finding her father alone in his study one night when she was 16, staring at nothing in particular, and asking him what he was thinking about. He'd smiled at her, the tired, gentle smile she'd come to associate with him specifically, and told her he couldn't quite remember anymore. Not the answer to her question, what he used to think about, before thinking about anything outside the household had quietly become a luxury he'd stopped affording himself. And you thought that's what would happen to us, Sora said slowly, pieces of 6 years finally rearranging themselves into a coherent shape. Hannah nodded, tears threatening for the first time that evening. I was 21 and terrified, and I didn't have the words to explain a fear that big without sounding completely irrational. So I found an escape route that sounded reasonable on paper, and I let you believe it was about opportunity instead of about a panic I never learned how to name. Sora was quiet for a long moment, watching the rain streak down the terminal windows beside them. I spent a long time thinking I just wasn't the kind of future someone wanted to choose, he finally said. It never once occurred to me you were running from a future that had nothing actually to do with me. You were never the problem, Sora, Hannah said quickly, urgently, as though the 6 years of silence had finally given the sentence enough pressure behind it to come out fully formed. You were steady and kind and exactly the kind of partner I actually wanted. I was just terrified that wanting you that much would eventually cost me everything else about myself, the way it cost my mother. I made you into a symbol of a fear that was never really about you at all, and I am so sorry it took 6 years and a canceled flight for me to say that clearly. Sora reached over, gently taking her hand for the first time that evening, not saying anything for a long moment, simply letting the weight of 6 years of misunderstanding finally settle into something considerably lighter than either of them had carried it as before. I spent 6 years building a life specifically designed to never end up like my parents, Hannah continued. Independent. Successful. Nobody's obligation to disappear for. And it worked in the sense that I never lost myself the way I was scared of. But somewhere along the way, I also just never let anyone close enough to matter. I told myself that was independence. I think, honestly, it was just the same fear wearing a more respectable costume. There was a specific night, about 8 months ago, she continued, her voice quieter now. My birthday. I was sitting alone in an apartment I'd chosen specifically because it only had room for one person, genuinely, deliberately proud of how self-sufficient I'd become. And somewhere around midnight, it just hit me all at once that I'd built an entire beautiful life with absolutely no room in it for anyone else and called it strength instead of what it actually was. She'd cried that night, for the first time in longer than she could remember, not over any specific loss, but over the slow, accumulated weight of 6 years spent protecting herself from something she'd never actually properly tested, whether love, done carefully and honestly, might not have to look anything like the version she'd watched consume her parents. Sora moved into the seat directly beside her, closing the careful distance he'd maintained since first sitting down. For what it's worth, he said, I don't think loving someone automatically means disappearing into them. I think your parents just never figured out how to hold on to themselves while doing it. That doesn't mean it's impossible. It just means it takes more intention than either of them managed. How do you know that? She asked quietly. Sora considered the question seriously before answering. I don't completely, but I know that the 6 years since you left, I never stopped being myself waiting for you to come back. I just also never stopped hoping you would. The gate agent's voice returned overhead, announcing a further delay that pushed the total wait past 5 hours, the storm outside showing no meaningful sign of clearing. A collective groan rippled through the increasingly restless waiting area, though neither Hannah nor Sora reacted with the same frustration as everyone around them. I think the universe might actually be trying to make a point, Hannah said, a small, genuine laugh escaping despite the heaviness of the last hour's conversation. Sora smiled, the same warmth she remembered from 6 years earlier, now layered with something steadier. 6 hours does feel like an oddly specific amount of time for coincidence, he agreed. They shared a bag of vending machine snacks neither of them particularly wanted, talking more easily now than they had in the first tense hour, catching up on 6 years of smaller details, favorite books, changed opinions, the specific ways they'd each grown since the people they used to be at 21. Are your parents still together? Sora asked at one point, genuinely curious rather than merely making conversation. Hannah nodded. They are. I actually think they're happier now than they were when I was growing up, now that my brother and I are both grown and gone. I used to think that meant I'd been wrong about the whole thing. Now I think it just means they lost themselves for a long stretch and eventually, slowly, found their way back to who they used to be. I just didn't want to wait 25 years to find that out the hard way myself. Sora considered that for a moment. That's actually a hopeful way to look at it, he said. Even the version you were scared of eventually found its way back to something good. Maybe that means the fear was never really about avoiding the hard stretch, just about not knowing if you'd survive it. As the 6th hour of the delay approached, Sora finally asked the question that had been quietly building since her confession. Can I ask what changes now? He said carefully. You've named the fear. That's not nothing. But naming something and actually being ready to risk it again aren't automatically the same thing. Hannah appreciated, more than she could easily express, that he'd asked it as an honest question rather than a demand for reassurance. I don't know that I have a perfect answer, she admitted, but I know that 6 years of running from exactly this feeling hasn't actually made me happier. It just made me lonelier in a more organized, defensible way. I don't want to keep doing that. What I can offer, she continued, is honesty this time. If I feel that old panic creeping in again, and I probably will because 6 years of habit doesn't just disappear because we had one honest conversation in airport, I'll tell you. Instead of quietly building an escape route and calling it something else. That's the actual promise I can make. Not that I won't be scared, just that I won't lie about it anymore. Sora nodded slowly, something in his chest loosening at the specificity of it. Not a grand, sweeping promise that nothing would ever go wrong again, but something smaller and considerably more trustworthy. An honest accounting of exactly what she could offer, and a clear-eyed acknowledgement of what she still couldn't fully guarantee. I'm not asking you to promise anything, Sora said quietly. I'm asking if you'd be willing to actually try, slowly, with both of us being honest about the fear instead of one of us quietly running from it. Hannah looked down at their hands, close but not yet touching, 6 years of careful distance sitting in that small remaining gap. Slowly, deliberately, Hannah closed the small distance between their hands. I'd like to try, she said. Not because 6 hours in an airport fixes 6 years of fear, but because I think I'm finally ready to find out whether the fear was ever actually about you, or just about a story I never questioned closely enough. Sora exhaled slowly, something in his shoulders visibly loosening after 6 years of carrying a version of the story that had never been the whole truth. Then let's actually find out, he said, slowly. Honestly, no apartment listings until we're both genuinely ready for that conversation. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while after that, letting the decision settle rather than rushing to fill the space with more words. 6 years of separate lives didn't undo themselves in a single conversation, however honest, and both of them seemed to understand that instinctively, that what they'd just agreed to was a beginning, not a resolution, and that the real work of rebuilding trust would happen slowly, in ordinary moments considerably less dramatic than a delayed flight. Hannah laughed, the tension of the entire evening finally, fully releasing, and leaned into his shoulder the way she used to without thinking about it 6 years earlier. Deal, she said. Though for the record, I hear Osaka has excellent apartments, purely hypothetically, several years from now. In the remaining time before boarding, they traded phones back and forth, showing each other small, ordinary pieces of the 6 years they'd missed. A cat Sora had adopted 2 years earlier and adored more than he'd ever admit to his co-workers. A handful of photographs from Hannah's years abroad, cities and moments neither of them had been able to share with the other in real time. When Hannah showed him a photo of her current apartment, clean, minimal, deliberately unfurnished beyond the basics, Sora studied it for a long moment before looking up at her. It looks like a place designed for someone who's always ready to leave, he said gently, not unkindly. Hannah nodded slowly. I think that's exactly what it was, she admitted. I just never let myself see it that clearly until tonight. At exactly 12:47 a.m., 6 hours and 7 minutes after the original departure time, the gate agent's voice returned overhead with the announcement the entire terminal had been waiting for. Flight 227 was finally ready for boarding, the storm having cleared just enough to allow departure. Hannah and Sora stood together, gathering their bags among the exhausted, relieved crowd of fellow delayed passengers, both of them quietly aware that they were boarding an entirely different flight than the one they'd each expected to be on 6 hours earlier. Not just in destination, but in what they were carrying with them onto it. Same row, by any chance? Sora asked, glancing at his boarding pass with a small, hopeful smile. Hannah checked her own pass and laughed. Different rows, actually, but I think I can live with a short walk down the aisle to come find you. Somewhere above the clouds that had grounded them together for 6 hours, Hannah found her way to Sora's row not long after takeoff, settling into the empty seat beside him without either of them needing to discuss it. 6 years of silence had ended not with a dramatic gesture, but with bad weather, a crowded gate, and two people finally running out of convenient reasons to keep avoiding a conversation they'd both been ready for longer than either wanted to admit. Somewhere over the ocean, Hannah finally told him about the wedding and the restroom, and the fear she'd suppressed a full year before either of them realized their relationship was actually ending. Sora listened without judgment, simply grateful, finally, to understand the entire shape of a story he'd only ever known half of. I remember that wedding, he said quietly. I remember thinking you seemed distracted that whole night. I just never imagined it was because of something that's specific. 6 years is a long time to carry something alone, Sora said eventually, his thumb moving gently across her knuckles. For what it's worth, I'm glad the weather finally forced the conversation neither of us seemed able to start on our own. Hannah smiled, resting her head against his shoulder as the plane carried them both toward a city and a future that finally felt like something they were choosing together rather than something either of them needed to run from. If you've ever run from something good out of fear it would cost you yourself, let us know in the comments below. And if this story moved you, subscribe to Echoes of Us Anime. We bring you a new story just like this every single week.